As the cold autumn wind howled across the German border, American troops stood poised before the formidable Siegfried Line. The air was thick with tension. Each soldier knew that beyond those fortified bunkers and dragon's teeth lay a battle that could change the course of the war. Would they break through, or would the enemy's defenses prove too strong? The wind carried the scent of damp earth and gun oil as the American troops tightened their grips on their weapons. Ahead of them, stretching like a steel spine across the landscape, loomed the Siegfried Line. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles known as dragon's teeth, and deep trenches formed an unyielding barrier, built to keep them out. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds crouched behind a fallen log, studying the terrain through a pair of binoculars. He had seen battle before, but nothing quite like this. The Siegfried Line was more than just a defensive structure. It was a statement, a final line in the sand drawn by a desperate enemy. He knew breaking through would be no easy task. The Germans had spent years fortifying their position, and their soldiers were determined to hold the line at any cost. Reynolds turned to his men. "Stay low, stay quiet," he whispered. "We don't want to give them an excuse to open fire just yet." His voice, though calm, carried an edge of urgency. Around him, soldiers adjusted their gear, checking ammunition and grenades. Their breath was visible in the cold air, merging with the fog that clung to the ground like a ghostly veil. Private Joe Carter swallowed hard. He had only been with the unit for a few weeks, yet he could already feel the weight of war pressing down on his shoulders. The stories he had heard from the older soldiers, the ones who had survived Normandy and the hedgerows of France, were enough to keep him awake at night. Now, standing on the precipice of another major offensive, he wondered if he would live to see another sunrise. Somewhere in the distance, a machine gun nest came to life, rattling off a short burst before falling silent again. It was a warning, a reminder that the enemy was watching. The Germans knew they were coming. There would be no surprise attack, no easy way through. If the Americans wanted to advance, they would have to fight for every inch of ground. Reynolds motioned for his men to move forward. They advanced in a slow, deliberate crawl, careful to keep their heads down. The ground was uneven, churned up by past skirmishes and scattered with debris. Empty shell casings glinted in the dim light, remnants of previous battles that had already claimed too many lives. A sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable thud of a mortar shell slamming into the earth. A deafening explosion sent dirt and shrapnel flying, forcing the soldiers to flatten themselves against the ground. More shells followed, each one shaking the earth beneath them. The bombardment had begun. "Find cover!" Reynolds shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The men scrambled, diving into craters and behind whatever solid structures they could find. Carter pressed himself against the cold ground, heart pounding as chunks of debris rained down around him. He could hear the distant shouts of German soldiers, their voices carried by the wind. The enemy was close, too close. Sergeant Tom Davies, a grizzled veteran who had seen more battles than he cared to remember, crawled up beside Reynolds. "They're trying to soften us up before we even get to the main defenses," he said grimly. "If we stay out here much longer, we'll be easy pickings." Reynolds nodded, wiping dust from his face. He knew they couldn't afford to be pinned down in no man's land. The longer they remained exposed, the greater the risk of casualties. He had to make a decision, and fast. Signaling to his radio operator, he called for artillery support. Within moments, the distant rumble of American guns filled the air. The response was swift and brutal. Explosions erupted along the Siegfried Line, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the sky. The ground trembled under the relentless bombardment, and for a brief moment, the enemy's fire slackened. Seizing the opportunity, Reynolds rallied his men. "Move up. Now's our chance." With adrenaline surging through their veins, the soldiers pushed forward, weaving through the chaos as bullets whizzed past them. Some fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground before they could even cry out. Others pressed on, driven by duty and the sheer will to survive. As they neared the first set of dragon's teeth, Corporal Henry Lawson pulled a satchel charge from his pack. He set the explosives against the massive concrete barriers and lit the fuse before scrambling back. A second later, a thunderous blast shattered a portion of the obstacle, creating a narrow gap for the troops to slip through. Gunfire erupted from the nearby bunkers as German soldiers unleashed a relentless barrage. The Americans returned fire, their rifles cracking in rapid succession. Grenades arced through the air, exploding in flashes of light and sound that momentarily blinded those caught in the blast. Carter pressed himself against a dirt embankment, gripping his rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He spotted movement ahead, an enemy soldier taking aim from behind a sandbag barricade. Without thinking, Carter raised his weapon and fired. The German soldier slumped forward, his rifle clattering to the ground. Carter exhaled sharply, realizing he had been holding his breath. The reality of war had just become very real. The battle raged on, the sound of combat filling the air. Each step forward was met with resistance, each victory hard-earned. The Siegfried Line was not just a physical barrier, it was a test of endurance, courage, and sacrifice. As night fell, the battlefield was littered with the scars of war. Fires burned in the distance, casting eerie shadows over the landscape. The American troops had gained ground, but at a heavy cost. There was no time to dwell on the losses, no moment to pause. The fight was far from over, and the true challenge still lay ahead. Reynolds scanned the horizon, his expression grim. "Get some rest while you can," he told his men. "Tomorrow we push deeper." The soldiers nodded, exhaustion etched into their faces. They knew what awaited them beyond the next ridge. More bunkers, more machine guns, more danger. But they also knew there was no turning back. The Siegfried Line had to fall, no matter the cost. In the cold silence of the night, the battlefield remained alive with the echoes of war. The wind carried the whispers of the fallen, their sacrifice etched into the very soil beneath their brothers' boots. And as the soldiers prepared for the next battle, they knew one thing for certain. History was being written with every step they took. The sky was streaked with the pale light of dawn, but the battlefield remained cloaked in thick smoke. Fire still burned in the distance, their glow casting eerie shadows across the ruined landscape. The ground was uneven, scarred by relentless artillery fire, littered with shattered weapons, spent casings, and the remains of those who had fought and fallen. The air carried the metallic tang of blood, mixing with the scent of damp earth and burning debris. Reynolds moved carefully through the trenches, his boots sinking into the mud. Every step forward was measured, every movement calculated. The enemy had been pushed back, but they were far from defeated. Somewhere ahead, beyond the ridgeline, German reinforcements were no doubt preparing their counterattack. The night had given them only a temporary advantage. The real test was still to come. The men took what little time they had to regroup. Some crouched behind the remains of a destroyed bunker, reloading their weapons with steady hands despite the exhaustion etched into their faces. Others simply sat with their backs against the cold earth, eyes staring into the distance, their minds caught somewhere between the present and the memories of what had just transpired. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Carter pressed his forehead against his rifle, the weight of fatigue settling over him like a heavy blanket. His fingers still felt numb from the battle, his ears ringing from the constant roar of gunfire. Sleep tugged at the edges of his consciousness, but he knew better than to give in. Rest was a luxury they could not afford. He forced himself to stay alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Davies approached, his face smeared with dirt, his expression unreadable. "They'll be coming soon," he muttered. "We need to be ready." Reynolds nodded. He had no doubt the enemy would retaliate. They had fought too hard to let the Americans push through without a fight. Their pride, their orders, and their very survival depended on holding the line. He could almost hear them now, just beyond the trees, gathering their strength, preparing to strike. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of engines. Tanks. The low rumble sent a shiver down Carter's spine. He tightened his grip on his rifle, stealing a glance at Reynolds, who was already signaling the men into position. There was no time to hesitate. The battle was about to begin again. A sharp crack split the air as the first gunshot rang out. Then another. Within seconds, the battlefield erupted into chaos once more. The enemy surged forward, their silhouettes barely visible through the haze. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, tracer rounds slicing through the air like fiery streaks. The ground trembled under the weight of advancing armor, their massive treads crushing everything in their path. Reynolds barked orders, his voice cutting through the din of battle. Carter dropped to one knee, taking aim at a figure rushing toward their position. His shot found its mark, but there was no time to register the impact. More soldiers were coming, their rifles blazing, their shouts lost in the storm of war. Explosions tore through the trenches, sending showers of dirt and shrapnel skyward. The world became a blur of movement and sound, each second stretching into eternity. Carter ducked as a mortar shell whistled overhead, the blast knocking him backward. His ears rang, his vision swam, but he forced himself to move, crawling through the wreckage to find cover. Davies was beside him, firing methodically, his expression grim. "Hold the line," he shouted. "We can't let them break through." The order was clear, but holding ground against an onslaught like this seemed impossible. The Germans were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Machine guns chattered from the remaining bunkers, cutting down advancing troops in a hail of bullets. Smoke grenades were thrown to obscure their movement, but the enemy pressed on, undeterred. Carter saw Reynolds hurl a satchel charge toward an approaching tank, the explosion rocking the battlefield. Flames erupted from the vehicle's hull, sending German soldiers scattering for cover. But for everyone that fell, more seemed to appear, their resolve unshaken. The ground was slick with mud and blood. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some still clutching their weapons, frozen in their final moments. The weight of the battle bore down on Carter, but he pushed forward, firing at anything that moved. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The sun had fully risen now, its light cutting through the smoke, revealing the full horror of the battlefield. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in the trenches, knives flashing, fists flying. The desperation was palpable, each man fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Reynolds spotted a German officer shouting orders from behind a barricade. Without hesitation, he signaled to Davies, who nodded in understanding. The sergeant sprinted through the chaos, weaving between bodies and gunfire, his rifle trained on the target. A single shot rang out, and the officer crumpled, his command lost in an instant. The enemy hesitated, their momentum faltering. Sensing the shift, Reynolds called for an all-out push. The Americans surged forward, bayonets fixed, determination burning in their eyes. The Germans, leaderless and battered, began to fall back, their resistance finally breaking. Carter barely had time to process what was happening. One moment, they had been on the brink of collapse, and the next, the enemy was retreating. He watched as the remaining German soldiers disappeared into the trees, their gunfire fading into the distance. The battle was over for now. The battlefield was silent once more, save for the labored breathing of those who remained standing. Reynolds exhaled, wiping the sweat from his brow. They had won this fight, but at a great cost. He surveyed the field, his gaze lingering on the fallen, his jaw tightening. There was no time to grieve. The war was far from over. Carter sank to the ground, his rifle resting across his lap. His hands were still shaking, his mind struggling to process everything he had just witnessed. He had survived another battle, but the weight of it all pressed heavy on his chest. Reynolds clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Get some rest, kid," he said. "We've got a long road ahead." Carter nodded, but he knew sleep wouldn't come easy. Not after what he had seen. Not with the echoes of battle still ringing in his ears. The Siegfried Line had not yet fallen, but they had taken one step closer. Tomorrow, they would march again. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. The battlefield stretched endlessly, littered with craters and the twisted remains of barbed wire. Somewhere in the distance, the muffled sound of wounded soldiers groaning mingled with the distant rumble of artillery fire. The night was far from silent. Even in the brief lull between battles, the war never truly slept. Reynolds wiped the grime from his face and glanced at his men. They were exhausted, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, but their eyes held a steely determination. Each soldier had seen more in the past 24 hours than most men saw in a lifetime. They had been thrown into the fire, yet they still stood, gripping their rifles like lifelines. Some whispered quiet prayers, others simply stared ahead, waiting for the next command. Carter sat with his back against a shattered tree trunk, hands trembling slightly as he reloaded his weapon. He tried to steady his breathing, but the images of the last fight replayed in his mind. The man he had shot, the lifeless body crumpling to the ground. It had happened so fast. His first real kill. He knew it wouldn't be his last. A tap on his shoulder startled him. Sergeant Davies knelt beside him, offering a cigarette. "First one's always the hardest," Davies muttered, lighting his own. Carter hesitated before taking the cigarette, inhaling deeply. The smoke burned his throat, but it steadied his nerves. He wasn't sure if Davies was right, if it would ever get easier, but he nodded anyway. The older man had been through hell and back. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. Reynolds crouched beside a makeshift table where a map was spread out, its edges curling from the damp air. The Siegfried Line was no ordinary defensive position. It was an intricate labyrinth of bunkers, trenches, and artillery placements. Every inch of it was designed to stall an enemy advance, to bleed them dry before they could breach its defenses. The first wave had cost them dearly, and the hardest part was yet to come. "The Germans are dug in tight," Davies said, his voice low. "They've had years to prepare for this fight." Reynolds nodded, tracing a route on the map with his finger. "We move at dawn. We've got to punch through their forward defenses before they can reinforce." A low murmur passed through the ranks as the men absorbed the news. There was no arguing with orders, no room for hesitation. They all understood what was at stake. As the first light of morning crept over the battlefield, the stillness was shattered by the sudden roar of artillery. Explosions sent plumes of dirt skyward, the ground trembling beneath the force. The Germans had anticipated their advance. Machine guns chattered from concealed bunkers, cutting down soldiers before they could take cover. Screams echoed through the chaos, but the men pressed forward, diving into foxholes and behind the wreckage of war-torn vehicles. Carter gritted his teeth and fired toward the pillboxes ahead. The enemy was relentless, their bullets tearing through the air like wasps. The world around him blurred into smoke, fire, and the deafening symphony of war. Somewhere to his right, a soldier crumpled, a crimson stain spreading across his chest. There was no time to stop, no time to process the loss. Reynolds signaled to a demolition team. They crawled through the dirt, carrying satchel charges toward the nearest bunker. A burst of enemy fire took one of them down, but the others kept moving, placing the explosives against the thick concrete walls. Seconds later, a powerful blast rocked the structure, sending debris flying. The breach sent panic through the German line. As smoke poured from the shattered bunker, the Americans surged forward. Grenades sailed through the air, clearing out trenches, while riflemen picked off the remaining defenders. The enemy fought fiercely, refusing to surrender, but the momentum had shifted. Carter found himself at the edge of a trench, peering down at a group of enemy soldiers, scrambling for cover. One of them turned, their eyes meeting for a fleeting moment. Carter hesitated, but instinct took over. He squeezed the trigger. The German fell backward, and Carter's stomach twisted. There was no time for second thoughts. A cry from behind made him whirl around. Reynolds was pinned down, trapped behind a collapsed section of earthworks as a machine gun raked the ground around him. Without thinking, Carter sprinted toward him, bullets kicking up dust at his feet. He slid behind cover, breathing heavily. "We gotta take that nest out," Reynolds shouted over the gunfire. Carter nodded, gripping a grenade. He pulled the pin, counted to 3, and hurled it toward the enemy position. A muffled explosion followed, the machine gun falling silent. Reynolds clapped him on the back. "Nice work, kid." The battle raged on, but inch by inch, the Americans gained ground. They pushed deeper into the Siegfried Line, clearing bunkers and forcing the enemy to retreat. Victory wasn't certain, but for the first time, it felt within reach. As the sun climbed higher, the battlefield was a sea of destruction. Smoke curled from the remains of fortifications. Bodies lay scattered among the ruins, and the air carried the heavy scent of gunpowder and blood. Yet the men pressed on, their resolve unshaken. Carter wiped sweat from his brow, staring at the landscape ahead. More battles awaited them, more challenges to overcome. But in that moment, standing among his comrades, he knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a survivor, and he would see this fight through to the end.